ikincisini düzenliyoruz. Bir önceki sempozyumumuz 2021 yılındaydı. Konumuz günümüzde felsefe tarihçiliğiydi. Birbirinden güzel konuşmalar dinledik. Bu konuşmaların kayıtlarına dilerseniz YouTube kanalımız üzerinden ulaşabilirsiniz. Bu yılki konumuzu ise doğa olarak belirledik. Biraz niçin bu konuyu seçtiğimiz üzerine konuşmak istiyorum. Daha sonra ise kısaca etkinliğimizi tanıtmak istiyorum size. Aslında düzenleme kurulu olarak bu konuyu seçerken aklımızda
As
21.
organizing committee, we had this question in our minds: what is the possibility of doing philosophy of nature in the 21st century? Since, as we know, historically, philosophy actually started as a philosophy of nature. Together with the Miletus school, it emerged as an effort to understand nature first and foremost. Today, we have largely left the work of understanding nature to the sciences. Perhaps post-humanist philosophy or new materialism can constitute exceptions as theories that are still making an ontology of nature and are actually growing in popularity. Of course, philosophy has not completely stopped thinking about nature. Nature continues to be a very popular topic for philosophy in different aspects. Crisis, environmental justice, Anthropocene debates are also on the agenda of contemporary philosophy. And we wanted to think about nature together at our symposium this year. When we decided to organize the symposium, we had some questions in our minds, and then brand new questions entered our horizons during the process of organizing the symposium. And we realized that there was a richer discussion area here than we originally thought. We have rediscovered the ontological, scientific, cultural, ethical, political, and aesthetic aspects of philosophical inquiry into nature. And while inviting our speakers to this event, we try to reflect the richness of this field in our program as much as possible. I hope we have achieved this. Our program consists entirely of invited speakers, and our speakers have expertise in different fields of philosophy, such as ethics, ecological philosophy, science philosophy, philosophy of art, ecofeminist philosophy, and political philosophy. We also have a sociologist as a speaker. So for 2 days, we aim to think and discuss about nature from different perspectives together. I would like to say this from the beginning. The discussion parts that will take place at the end of each session are just as important as the speeches to be made during this event. If you have questions for our speakers, you can send them to us via Zoom or YouTube, and our moderators will forward these questions to the speakers, and hopefully a lively discussion will take place in the end. Let me tell you a little about our sessions and our speakers. Our first session will start at 4:30 Turkish time, and our speakers will be Christopher Schlottmann and Ezgi Ece Çelik. As I just said, while the symposium was still in the process of determining our subject, we already had a few ideas in our minds. One of the issues we definitely wanted to discuss in the symposium was the nature-culture dichotomy. Ezgi Ece Çelik is already a lecturer who we know has been working on this subject for a while and is known for her work on nature-culture continuity. Therefore, of course, we wanted to invite her. She will give us a speech in which she examines this issue through a number of thinkers such as Lovelock, Margulis, Haraway, Latour, and Leopold, and will investigate the possibility of a new policy that also takes into account non-human perpetrators. The other speaker in the session is Christopher Schlottmann. He's a philosopher who studies food ethics and food policies. We came across his work during our preparations for the symposium, actually. Food is actually at the heart of nature-culture debate because food is a natural biological need for us, quote unquote, but it is also a cultural, ethical, and political act. Christopher Schlottmann will give us a talk on the ethical and political dimensions of our modern agricultural practices. And this way, he will actually open the category of naturalness to discussion. What does natural nutrition mean? For instance, is such a thing possible, etc. So Schlottmann will open these questions to discussion. In today's second session, we were actually going to have two speakers, like in all sessions. But after one of our speakers accepted our invitation, he probably changed his idea because we could not reach him again. That's why we couldn't include him in the program. We hope he's well and all is well with him. Therefore, our speaker in the session will be one person, Cem Kamözüt, a philosopher of science. When we decided to organize a symposium, again, one of the issues that bothered us, that made us think, was Anthropocene. This is a very popular term today and is used to refer to a period when the impact of humans on nature has now reached a level that will usher in a new geological age. In his own speech, Cem Kamözüt will discuss whether Anthropocene can really be the name of the geological period or a functional term only in terms of social sciences. So he will be opening this to discussion. This way, we will end the first day of our symposium. Tomorrow, we have 3 sessions in total. We open our first session at 12 o'clock Turkish time with Rosemary Hancock and Ezgi Ece Çelik. Rosemary Hancock is a researcher in the sociology of religion, and she works especially on Muslim communities and environmentalism and activism, particularly in these communities. She became a researcher whose work we encountered during our preparations for the symposium, actually. She's going to give us a talk on Islamic environmentalism. And of course, we wanted to invite a philosopher of art to our event, keeping in mind that our relationship with nature is not only ontological, ethical, and political, but also aesthetic, who's Ezgi Ece Çelik. In the past year, we often witness the actions of climate activists by going to museums, throwing up soup or paint at artworks. These protests have sparked a series of debates about why these activists targeted the works of art and whether this was the right form of protest. A series of debates were ignited by this. This made us think more about the relationship between the climate crisis and art. Ezgi Ece will give a speech to discuss the relationship between the climate crisis and art. And together we will think about how the crisis affects art and what opportunities artworks can offer us in the middle of a crisis. This issue actually leads us directly to a speech in our second session, to Elisa Altola's speech. It is obvious that the protests made by throwing paint at artworks in museums aim to arouse some emotions in us. And many climate actions actually aim to mobilize us by arousing some emotions in us. We can say that fear, shame, and guilt are at the forefront of these feelings. We knew about Altola's work on animal ethics, but we also learned that she had been thinking for a while about how effective feelings of shame and guilt were in getting us to act on the climate crisis. And we were very excited about this because although the images of disasters that frequently circulate in the media about the climate crisis or the apocalyptic, catastrophic, end of the world narratives that are very popular in speculative fiction aim to arouse a kind of unrest in us. It is also controversial how effective these feelings are in pushing us into political action on this issue. That's exactly what Elisa Altola and I are going to think about. The next speaker of our second session is Eylem Canaslan, who we know for her work on Spinoza. She's also a philosopher who works on the philosophy of ecology. And while we were preparing for the symposium, we were very excited to come across the book titled Naturalism or Remembering Nature While Losing It, which she compiled with Cemal Badi Akal, because we realized that this book was compiled with very similar concerns to ours. This is a book that aims to revive a forgotten tradition of philosophy of nature in the 21st century. When we invited Eylem, we actually had in mind to ask her for a speech on how we can read Spinoza's naturalism today, but Eylem reminded us of another meaning of the word nature that we have forgotten. Apologies. The qualities that make something, exactly that thing that is nature in its own essence. So it's like when we say human nature. Eylem Jonathan will give a speech on how today's neurotechnological developments have radically transformed and will continue to transform what we understand from the term human nature. And we're conducting the last session of tomorrow, the closing session, with the keynote speech of this event with Lori Grün. Lori Grün is a very famous philosopher for her work in ecofeminism and animal ethics. Ecofeminism is an intellectual and political movement that argues that there's a close relationship between our domination of nature and the domination of women, and that the feminist struggle cannot be carried out independently of the ecological struggle. But more and more recently, ecofeminism has focused not only on the parallels between the exploitation of women and the exploitation of nature, but also on how different forms of domination and exploitation nurture one another. Lori Grün will give us a closing speech in which she also will show us the links this issue has with racism, colonialism, and capitalism. It will bring into question how placing some beings under the category of nature also naturalizes the power established over them, and draw attention to the importance of purging ecofeminism from colonialist ideology. And so our event will come to an end. Before moving to our first session at 4:30, I would like to say a few sentences about why we chose the title of After Nature, Doğanın Ardından in Turkish, as the title of our symposium. So, the word after has two different meanings in English. The first is to say in the aftermath of something. In other words, when we say after nature, in the sense that this title means that we're talking about something that has disappeared and come to an end. In the sense, it is a title that is a little sad and evokes a state of mourning. However, the word after has another meaning, which is something like following after. The word after can also mean this, like when we say to go after something. I think this second meaning of the word is more in line with the main concern of our symposium. We will spend 2 days being after nature, chasing nature together. I hope it will be a nice event for all of us. Welcome back again. Shall we start the first session or shall we start at 4:30 is the question.
Şöyle hocam saat 16:30'u aslında hani önceden bir teknik sorun çıkarsa biraz vaktimiz olsun diye.
Actually, I had designated 4:30 in case there would be a technical problem. We can actually start at 4:30. This is how we announced it. Maybe there might be arrivals just before 4:30. So let's wait for 7 minutes. Thank you.
Güven hocam, ne zaman isterseniz başlatabiliriz.
We can begin whenever we want. If you will, we can begin. Okay. Let me wait for a while. Welcome everyone again. I am Güven Güzeldere. I'm a philosopher. Sometimes I have fluctuating internet connection. Sometimes if you lose my connection, please let me repeat whatever I say, because sometimes I'm not aware of that I'm disconnected. We are in the second International Philosophy Symposium titled Following the Nature. In the first session, we will have two speakers. One is from New York, Professor Christopher Schlottmann. The second speaker will be from İzmir, Ezgi Ece Çelik from 9 Eylül University. Let me first introduce our colleagues, then let me give floor to them. Christopher Schlottmann is a lecturer in the Environmental Studies Department in New York University, and he is focusing on philosophical analysis of various environmental issues, and his projects are dedicated to the ethical dimensions in the intersection of food, environment, and ethics. He has many articles and also a book written on this. We will be beginning with Christopher Schlottmann. We will have half an hour speech. Following half an hour, we will have some time related to question and answer and the discussions. Professor Schlottmann will be speaking about naturalness in stories about food and environment. He is also repeating the title in English to you.
Welcome. Thank you so much. Let me see if I can get my slides going and then I'll start. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much to the organizers for pulling this together. This is a very fundamentally important topic, as we all know, also one that is exceptionally interesting. So I'm looking forward to the other talks and conversations that come from today. My name is Chris Schlottmann. I'm at New York University in the Environmental Studies Department, where I'm an environmental ethicist who works on issues of food, animals, and the environment, and a little bit of everything else. And what I wanted to do today, kind of under the rubric of the conference theme, was to kind of both zoom out a little bit, kind of talk about the big picture where we are with our relationship to the environment, as well as zoom into what might be seen as kind of a pretty narrow, specific argument, but I'll try to make the case that it applies more broadly to the area of environmental ethics. And so for context, what I want to share is that my work attempts to be very integrative. And so what that means is I'm very much concerned about the strength of arguments we make about the values of nature and the complexity adherent to kind of the very difficult work of environmental ethics and food ethics. And I'm also exceptionally interested in how that plays out in the real world, right? We can have the most sound, internally logical, moral theory, for instance, and if we can't make it work in the human world, then that's clearly a weakness to something like that. And so I'm very interested in kind of the empirical side of things and how that flows into our moral decision-making and kind of, goes back and forth until we fine-tune something that seems workable. Within that larger context, what I'm going to talk about today is how we understand the ethical questions that arise when we're talking about food and the environment. Right. Again, we might have kind of perfect moral theories around this. I don't, but some people might think that they do. But I'm very interested in how we navigate the complexity of values in the real world. And so that's why I'm going to zoom in on this area that I will call stories. Okay, so this is my abstract, which you have. So I'm going to kind of zoom ahead to the next slide, because we only have a half an hour. What I'm going to do is basically present some empirical information, explain what I mean by stories, explain how we have a bit of a mismatch here, and then kind of map out some broad picture paths forward. So when we're talking about agriculture writ large, we are talking about one of the most significant anthropogenic drivers of environmental change in the world. It's right up there with climate change. We're talking about between 1/4 and 1/3 of anthropogenic greenhouse gases that we can attribute to the agricultural sector. If you zoom into any area like land use, biodiversity, water use, habitat change, zoonotic diseases, and more, agriculture is almost always the first thing on that list in terms of severity of anthropogenic change. And so we are talking about a kind of domain, agriculture, that has a massive environmental footprint, one that, some would argue is kind of the top of the list. Now, there's an increasing understanding of this, at least in the United States, and there's an increasing interest in kind of food movements and attempts to remediate some of the environmental impacts of our food system. And how we characterize kind of the nature of the problem, this is a very philosophical way to talk about things, is fundamentally important. And so let's start with some empirics, because I think this matters a lot, and we'll see how this plays out into the story domain shortly. So when we're talking about food, we're talking about the kind of the agricultural sector plus, which is inclusive of some non-food items, but we're going to simplify here and just talk about food. We are talking about this massive contribution to climate change. And if you zoom in to the food sector, from an environmental perspective, what we see is a very disproportionate contribution to environmental impact coming from the animal agriculture component of the food sector. So not all food is created equal when it comes to environmental impacts. I think that much is pretty easy to understand. What is always kind of interesting and often surprising to me is the disproportionate impact of animal agriculture within the agricultural sector. And this is due to a handful of reasons that have to do with conversion rates and trophic levels, secondary greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide, the scale of animal agriculture production, the concentration of certain animal agricultural activities, and more. And that's kind of for a different talk. But the first point is really just that we have this very significant footprint coming from the agricultural sector, and specifically an animal agricultural impact that is disproportionately large. Even if you adjust for calories, nutrients delivered, you name it, it's almost always many, many times more impactful to select an animal agricultural product compared to a plant-based one. And to kind of put a little bit of that scale in visual form, here are some other examples, right? We can see that even if we're just measuring or just looking at the mass, the weight of land mammals in the world, right? What we see in this depiction on the left here is this kind of slightly darker central section is all the humans, and the large section to the left is just the cows, right? There's 1.5 billion cattle, right, that we raise. They only live a year and a half on average. But in that time, they consume a lot of feed, they burp a lot of methane, they emit a lot of nitrous oxide. And so anytime we kind of look at these areas, we have to keep in mind the scale of animal agriculture is so substantial that its impacts do truly add up at this global scale. On the right, you can just see a representation in the US context of the percentage of our land that we use for animal agriculture, specifically for cattle grazing. And as we know, when we manipulate the land, we often emit carbon dioxide and create other environmental change. And so we're talking about a really significant impact when we're talking about these areas. Okay, so why does this matter? Okay, this matters because everyday human beings, presumably all of us, need simple enough ways to navigate the world, right? And of course, this is true in terms of empirics, in terms of non-moral decision-making, but also in this case, in terms of moral decision-making. And I'm using kind of as a shorthand, loosely this idea of stories, right? We tell ourselves a story about where environmental impacts come from, and that story guides us to kind of understanding what does and doesn't have environmental impacts and what the seriousness of those environmental impacts might be. And then some of these stories also tell us what is a better course of action or a worse course of action. So they morally guide us. And why I say stories instead of moral theory or something along those lines is just because they are much more cognitively easy to follow and simple, right? You don't go to a grocery store, pull out your phone, and then run a full life cycle analysis of an apple, right? And find out which farm it came from and call the farmer up to ask what pesticides they use, right? It's too much. We would never eat, right? We'd be hungry for the rest of our lives if we went through that kind of decision-making process. And so what we need is kind of a shorthand, a simple way to navigate the world that hopefully is more accurate than not, and hopefully is more guiding from a moral perspective than not. And so this is how I'm kind of carving out this domain that we might call stories, right? And here are some examples that I kind of present neutrally, but we're going to dive into the naturalness one shortly, right? But we might say, hey, if it's natural, it must be good for the environment, nature, environment, that kind of associates in my mind, therefore I'm going to choose the food product that looks natural, or I'm going to support the agricultural practice that I perceive as natural. You might have kind of an animal-oriented way of thinking about things. I don't want to consume products, or I do want to consume products by virtue of animals being involved in the process. You can think of a dozen different examples that have to do with degrees of intervention, the role of humans, the scale of behavior. There's a huge local food movement in the United States. That's one kind of simple story. I'm only going to eat things that are produced nearby, where I get to know my farmer and visit the farm and interact with people and things like that. So here's the kind of core of my argument, although I'm going to make lots of little arguments along the way on the side. But the main argument that I want to make is many of the stories that we tell about food do not align with our best empirical evidence about where the environmental impacts of food lie. And many of these stories arguably do not have a very sound set of moral principles behind them. So I want to kind of separate into descriptive and prescriptive stories. Good analytical philosophers, right? We like to make these distinctions, right? And so we're going to talk about these two kinds of threads. But of course, in practice, we integrate a lot of these things in our bodies. This is what it is like to be a living being. And so examples that are omnipresent in the States, and of course, I'm very curious to know if these are as present in Turkey as they are in the States, include this kind of interest in natural foods, natural diets. Often a practice is defended by being in the interest of the health of nature. We talk about grass-fed cows instead of grain-fed cows. We talk about organic agriculture all the time, right? All of these I'm kind of loosely lumping together in this heading of kind of natural food. And the basic idea there is that the story we're telling, right, is that natural food is better for the environment and people. Okay. So here's why I'm worried about that. So I'll give you a couple more examples, and these are from popular press books, maybe, that talk about food and their environmental impacts, using this idea of naturalness as a really fundamental organizing tool to make sense of environmental impacts. And so here we have two quotes from the same book from different people, but the first one talking about the necessity of animals in agricultural systems, because if you don't have, let's say, a cow on your small farm in a rural area, you would have to import synthetic nitrogen. And in this story, kind of something small, local, natural seems, pretty appealing from an environmental perspective. And industrial chemicals like synthetic fertilizer are deemed environmentally bad, right? And we'll get into the empirics of this in a moment. And then we have even kind of like zoomed out versions of this, just kind of Mother Nature has a way of promoting agriculture. I don't exactly know what this means in detail, but you get the sense, right? You're using an argument from naturalness in order to defend a certain agricultural practice with the claim that it's environmentally beneficial. Other examples, right? You can see the objection to genetically modified organisms, kind of not being aligned with nature. You can talk about something like a natural order that has kind of a prescription about how we might be acting. And you can talk about the kind of separation of certain moral views from this idea of nature, just to give a couple of examples. And then one of a dozen empirical points, but I figured I would include this one because the study was done by my colleague, Matt Hayek, just to kind of point out where we get into some sticky terrain very, very quickly. So if we were to convert our incredibly destructive, intensive animal agricultural system in the United States to one that is kind of more natural, extensive, uses more area, uses less synthetic inputs, we would need more space, which means more land use and land use change, which has its own environmental impacts. The animals would live a little longer, but that means that they also spend more time burping methane into the atmosphere. So if we were to convert to this natural system and consume comparable amounts of the same food, we would actually increase our environmental impact. And this is this very unfortunate tension we have between intensive and extensive modes of agriculture, each of which have significant environmental impacts. But the main point here is just to kind of burst this bubble a little bit. If it's natural, it does not translate into environmentally reduced impacts automatically at all. And another point to this effect is simply that we have 8+ billion inhabitants that are human on planet Earth right now. And if they are to continue to eat agricultural products, and we don't have the tools of industrial agriculture, as environmentally harmful as they are, right, we would have to then expand our agricultural footprint and really kind of take up the last forests and kind of non-arable land that's out there. So we do have this kind of situation, this high population, high density, high technology situation in the modern world. This is fundamental to the idea of the Anthropocene that needs to be accounted for. And my argument is basically that using these natural stories doesn't do a great job accounting for it. And so why are these stories about naturalness so kind of persistent? They've been exceptionally persistent in the US context for decades at this point. And I don't want to just be critical about them. I think they're psychologically resonant, and I think there's something very important to learn about that. I think that it aligns with a lot of people's needs to have some sort of relationship with nature. And this is the form it takes. So I think that comes from a place of good intention. And you can see that there's some positive virtues there. It also comes from a historical place. The US environmental movement historically is kind of dominated by individuals who kind of want to enjoy and appreciate nature. Right? Kind of one person hiking alone in the woods is kind of like your classic American environmental preservation kind of story. And this is kind of relatively aligned with something like that. And we could speculate about other possible things, but I do want to kind of give credit to the natural story for getting a couple things right. It's resonant, it works within a historical context, it has to do with attempts to have a positive relationship with nature. And so why is this interesting from a philosophy of nature perspective, which is kind of the overarching, theme of the conference? And so when we're talking about environmental ethics, philosophy of nature, there's often kind of very rightfully a serious concern about the amount of nature that's been destroyed and permanently altered. And there's conceptual questions about if nature even continues to exist, right? That some of us know already. And these are important questions, and they're difficult questions, and they're not easily resolved, and they're exceptionally important. Food is a very interesting space because it's basically a kind of relationship between humans and nature where interaction is required. Domestication is required, energy transfer is required, fundamental distortion of biological systems is required. And so there's not really a path through food ethics, environmental food ethics, where you can say the same kinds of arguments that you might say when it comes to wilderness areas, that the best argument is to leave this nature alone. You don't have that choice with food. You really have to get into a system, add nutrients, reduce nutrients, remove that food from the system. That's removing energy from an ecological system. And so it's by definition a cultured or domesticated or interactive space. And so I think this is important, one, because we want to accurately understand what kind of problem we're dealing with when we're dealing with food and the environment. But also I see it as a model because many environmental ethics rightfully are concerned with preserving nature, and that should continue, right? We also need environmental ethics of interactions with nature. The majority of the world's population lives in urbanized areas, for instance, right? We are talking about interacting with nature, right? The entire world is fundamentally climate change, right? You can't make arguments based on pure nature or wilderness conservation based on something like that. And so this is very nicely distilled very quickly by the historian J.C. Williams when he says, farming of any sort interrupts nature, right? And so as you can guess, this gets us to the kind of main million point here that concerns reliance on nature. When we are talking about what is natural, right, there's both definitional, descriptive components, as well as prescriptive, what we ought to do. And I rely heavily on this famous paper by John Stuart Mill on nature because he just got it right, so far as I'm concerned. So when we're trying to define nature, right, we can define it as everything that's around us, right? Gravity and living in the world, that kind of stuff. We could also define it as that which is non-human, right, which is a somewhat common definition that is used pretty regularly. And so this, of course, poses questions, and Mill talks through why this is actually a very insufficient way to define something, right? He says the first one is kind of, it's everything, so it doesn't mean anything anymore. So like everything's natural or nothing's natural, right? That doesn't help you describe the world particularly well. And then if we accept this second definition, natural is all non-human things, then it doesn't necessarily help us kind of make decisions at the end of the day. And so Mill makes this argument from definitions, a descriptive critique of natural food. And then he also talks about the prescriptive component, whether or not nature can guide us, right? And so because Lori is speaking at this conference, I thought I would find a quote from one of her books that talks about this. She's actually quoting Stephen Jay Gould, who, again, I think rightfully and very much in the Millian tradition says nature favors none and offers no guidelines, right? We could cherry pick a thing that happens in nature and say we should do it, but that's not guiding in a moral theory kind of sense, right? It doesn't give us a clear reason why something is right or wrong, good or bad, flourishing or not flourishing, et cetera, et cetera. And Mill makes this argument, and I wish more people had kind of internalized this argument when it was made, because it does seem like it resolves some of the problems that we have now that persist. Okay, so I'm of course going a little quick because of the time, and what I want to do is kind of wind down by talking a little bit about a mapping of the kinds of considerations we might make as we attempt to tell better stories about food and the environment. And of course, what I mean by better is a story that continues to be resonant, that continues to be mostly accurate, kind of descriptively, scientifically accurate, and also one that captures the moral values at stake, right? And I've kind of shown that I'm pretty wary of arguments from naturalness, despite their prevalence. I don't think they get us very far down the road of figuring out what in a kind of climate changed world, whether you accept the kind of Anthropocene argument or not, we do know that we live in a very human-dominated landscape where a lot of the old features and characteristics don't apply anymore, right? And so we would want the prescriptive stories to help us navigate this, right? Again, these are everyday rules of thumb, heuristics, models, whatever you want to call them. They're not intended to be perfect, but they are intended to guide us and kind of help us make better decisions in everyday life. And so such a story, consistent with an environmental ethic, would account for domesticated environments. And so what this means is that arguments from naturalness, let's protect what is natural and not touch it, don't get us very far when it comes to food systems, right? Because food systems are interactive, they're domesticated. There aren't many kind of hands-off examples of food systems where you just kind of like walk into the woods and grab fruit from a tree or something along those lines, that if it exists is a very rarefied way of feeding people. And even if it does exist, it's not going to feed 8.5 billion people. And so we really need to talk about what that interaction between humans and nature might be. And of course, we want that interaction to be one that reduces or minimizes environmental impact. This interactive characteristic is fundamentally important from an environmental perspective, because when you're manipulating nature, you have no choice but to cause some environmental impact. And of course, I don't say this as a justification for any bad agricultural practices or anything like that. It's just to say the way that this works biophysically is that we are moving energy through systems. Maybe we're creating nitrogen in one area and bringing it to a field so that it can be used as fertilizer for crops to grow. And then we're harvesting those crops. That land is land that was once a forest or a prairie, and so it was cleared. All of those parts of that storyline involve environmental impacts, right? CO2 emissions, erosion, moving energy through systems, changing the nitrogen cycle. And so there is manipulation, there is environmental impact. And that's just kind of a fact of the matter when it comes to food and farming. And so then that starts us off on a different path, right? We can no longer say hands off nature, let's just preserve it. We have to have an interactive model, right? And so any kind of plausible account, any story would have to have that interactive model. It also kind of carves out a complementary space within environmental ethics. A lot of environmental ethics, at least in the United States context, has been focused on making the strongest possible arguments for preserving what's left of wild nature, which again is amazing and worthwhile and fundamentally important. But the tools of that school of thought are not exceptionally well suited for the kind of problem that we have when we have food and environmental ethics. And so you can make kind of indirect arguments. We need to preserve nature and therefore really intensively farm other areas. That does get into different ethical arguments about how much you are harming kind of an intensively used agricultural area in order to preserve land, right? But either way, the kind of wilderness ethic itself isn't necessarily particularly well suited for a food ethics kind of topic. One possible path is to look into energy ethics because we have the same fundamental features, right? In order to create energy for human civilization and activities, we need to transform nature. And we all know there are more destructive and less destructive ways to do something like that. But in all cases, they are interactive, and it requires the manipulation of environmental cycles in order for humans to harness that energy in order to kind of fuel whatever technologies and modern civilizations that they might like. And I kind of gestured at this beginning, and of course, there's a lot more to say about this, but the centrality of animals is just so fundamental from an empirical perspective, but also simply from an ethical perspective, right? We can't claim to have a human environmental ethic that accounts for important values and not fully consider the animals that are part of that system. And this, I think, gestures in a different direction than the natural story. And of course, I don't have this awesome conclusion where I figured out the right story that we should be kind of telling, but I do think that moving away from this kind of natural oriented story and integrating and including animals in the story is a fundamentally important set of features that we need to align with. Okay, so this is my last slide with actual items on it, and I think maybe these are some of these we could pick up on in the conversation because, as I understand it, this is the end of the time. And so these are the kind of invitations that I would love to talk about more, given what we know about these various impacts on human, animals, and the environment. How can we tell stories and that are descriptive and stories that are prescriptive, and also kind of to be realistic, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these? Again, I don't think a simple everyday story that we tell about how to navigate the environment is going to be perfect under all circumstances. And so we do want to understand the strengths and weaknesses of this. And then we have some kind of proposed and possible starting points for crafting these stories as we move kind of more deeply into the Anthropocene. And so we might consider relational ethics that attempt to restore or build a new ethical relationship between humans, animals, and the environment that recognizes the tremendous amount of damage that humans have caused to animals in the environment, and see what can be done to kind of have a relationship that might be more productive. And I believe that Lori is going to speak, at least in part, to these kinds of questions. I kind of included some of the questions that the conference organizers mentioned as possible prompts that I would be happy to talk about in Q&A after the next panelist gives their presentations. And so we're out of time. So one last thing, I'll just say, I do think this is such a fundamentally important project. And I also do think that is very much in process. I don't think we know enough about this. I do think that we are in an exceptionally dynamic moment in time when it comes to the state of our natural systems. We have disturbed our climate systems so much that it's exceptionally difficult to even know what to expect kind of moving forward and how that might impact humanity and our values. Same thing is true for agricultural systems. And so we want to basically look forward and see what trajectory we're on, and then do our best as philosophers, as activists, as psychologists, as social systems theorists, however we're contributing to this, to kind of figure out how we might best navigate this new world that we are partly in already, that is going to be even more novel as we move forward. And I would kind of caution us about relying too heavily on these more backward looking or historically oriented models, because I don't think they do a great job of characterizing the situation we're in, and therefore might do us a disservice as we try to map out the way forward. So I look forward to talking with everyone about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Schlottmann.
Thank you.
Sorularınız
Any questions to Professor Schlottmann?
umuyorum. Oturumdaki konuşmamız Profesör Ezgi Ece Çelik.
For the moment, I give the floor to Ezgi Ece Çelik. She held her bachelor degree in philosophy in Hacettepe University, and in the same department, she conducted her master degree in 2012. In 2014, she joined a program in University of South Wales in Australia on ecology. Interpreter note, there is connection problems, it seems, with the speaker. And since 2019, she's been a member of the faculty in Ege University, Department of Philosophy, and the title of her speech is Gaia-politics, Life, Politics, and Science on Earth. I could barely hear you. There were problems with the connections. Hopefully, everybody heard it. Hopefully, the connection will be okay with internet. Hopefully, I won't have any problems. You can hear me well, right? First of all, I would like to thank everybody who has organized this symposium and Karun for this invitation. And I would like to say hello to everybody. Life, Politics, and Science on Earth. Gaia-politics is the title of my presentation. And actually, as has been mentioned in the opening speech, in the 21st century, is there a possibility of making a philosophy of nature, or how is it possible in our age? How can it be thought? So this question was important for me, because this philosophy of nature issue is something that I think as a philosophical ecology. You can think of it as a Gaia-politics or political ecology. Different thinkers can name it differently. But when you consider natural sciences and life sciences, ecology and ethics, so it is merging all of these, creating intersectionalities between all these. So this is the sort of philosophy of nature that I'm talking about, concerning the problems of today, and it will answer the problems of today. And this is what I've been studying. But when I say philosophy of nature, I'm not viewing nature only as an organic environment of living, but in terms of nature, culture, continuity, it is interaction and cooperation of humans and non-humans, organization of both. So I see it as a whole process of interaction and organization and collaboration. So this is what I mean when I say nature. I think this is going to be more right to think so, in a way. So I will refer to several thinkers' views, and I will interpret in this line. Actually, I will refer to 4 or 5 different thinkers without scattering too much, but the framework will be a bit wide. This is the draft that I prepared. So if there are anything missing, then we can actually wrap them up in the Q&A session. So who are these thinkers that I benefited from? James Lovelock, who is received his specialization in medicine, but he's known for his research in chemistry and physics. He's a natural scientist. Neil Margulis is a very important biologist. In evolutionary biology, he has very important research. Bruno Latour is a sociologist. Arnold Leopold is an ecologist, making relations with aesthetics and ethics. And Donna Haraway, I will refer to her at the end, concerning nature-culture continuity. If there are more detailed questions about Haraway, then we can actually elaborate on them. So actually, there are various thinkers like Isabel Stanger or Bruno Latour that use biopolitics, but I want to focus on only one thinker. When we say Gaia, we are reminded of James Lovelock's Gaia assumption. So what is this Gaia? Let me talk about that at the beginning. So differently from its meaning in mythology, Lovelock actually, when he was working in NASA, he sees the photo of Earth taken from space and sees this planet as home, and then develops the Gaia theory, Gaia assumption. So he says Gaia is the biosphere, atmosphere, oceans of this Earth. It comprises all these. It's a complex body. It actually aims for a cybernetic system and a reverse feedback of all this environment, all this system, says Lovelock, where everybody can be a perpetrator, a reverse feeding back and a cybernetic network. A part-whole relation is not at stake here. This planet has atmosphere, oceans, soil, and together with things living in it, it is a system that it organizes itself, according to Lovelock's Gaia approach. Back in 1979, he publishes his book on Gaia, A New Look on Life on Earth. And with all the aspects of Earth, the Earth is organizing itself and how it becomes home for the living beings. Actually, this book is referred to a lot by environmentalists. They are affected by the name Gaia, and actually William Golding, Lord of Flies author, actually suggests this name. So environmentalists like to refer to him, but Lovelock says that he's not as pessimistic as radical environmentalists, because in Lovelock's approach, there are differences when you look at his publishings chronologically. Concerning the planet, when there are references to, let's say, pollution and bad events, he says that he's not actually as pessimistic as the environmentalist back in the 1970s. For instance, Silent Spring is the book. Rachel Carson wrote it. Back in 1960s, she is actually drawing attention to the pesticides effects. But Lovelock says that such a silent spring hasn't been experienced without hearing the chirping of the birds, that we shall not evaluate it as pessimistically as Rachel Carlson does. And actually, Lovelock says, yes, we need to be careful, but if there's a silent spring that is experienced, it is not pesticides or DDT or these chemicals per se, but humans who will be using these chemicals in the wrong dosages. Rachel Carson, who's the author of Silent Spring, says in her book that from penguins in Antarctica till the milk of the mothers in the other parts of the planet, actually you can detect pesticide in all of these. Lovelock says that, yes, we need to take this into consideration, but let's not be radical. And these pesticides can actually be used in the right dosage, though. And if humans fail to use it in the right dosage, then that's what we need to focus on, he says. But in his next publication, Gaia's Revenge, or he draws attention to the fact that Gaia is sick as a living organism, that she has been maltreated. And she will take revenge. And the responsible is the human. So this is now a more pessimistic point of view, it seems. So Lovelock has grown pessimistic, it seems. And his latest publication after Anthropocene was hyper-intelligence will be managing the systems. Novacene. So we can talk about Novacene after Anthropocene. So this is a hyper-intelligence age. So look, there has been a change of views on Lovelock's side. So Lovelock is the first person that comes to mind when you say Gaia, but actually the thinker that he's affected by is Lynn Margulis. As I said, is a very important researcher in evolutionary biology. And when I was evaluating this Gaia question, I see Lynn Margulis more important and more so than Lovelock. I would like to focus on Lynn Margulis. According to Margulis, there's a symbiotic common life and collaboration. So there's a whole view of competition of species, but Lynn Margulis actually claims it's not like the best adapters survives, but coexistence, co-living, and sometimes she calls it solidarity and collaboration. Cooperation is also very effective in evolution and not only the survival of the fittest. And symbiosis is at the heart of her research. So in her book of Planet Coexisting Planet, she says, in order to understand the evolution of species, we need to understand coexistence because living beings live together, war together, copulate together, and die together. When you think of all forms of living, what is at the heart of creativity is bringing together the different types of living, and symbiogenesis entails the formation of new bodies, new organs, new species of beings that live for a long time together. Scientific classifications that omit this aspect are sufficient, and it is rendering us blind at the face of what we are evolving into. Actually, we are evolving as different species, and those views that does not see this is far away from understanding life, according to Lynn Margulis. And it is rendering us blind concerning the natural organization. The scientific views should actually reflect these organizations. And the scientific views actually can classify us in 3-5 millions, but life will always be a step ahead of us. The reproduction process is always in front of us. And the scientists conduct their classifications accordingly. So life is always a step ahead, and what scientists do is trying to come up with certain categorizations. So let's not ignore this. So within this context, Margulis says the scientist is not as strong to dominate the relations of living. So the role of the scientist should be more modest. And concerning the impartiality of the scientist, she has criticisms with her political stance. And in her own words, life actually besieges life through network, not through war, not killing others, but reproducing together with the others, becoming more complex this way. So creating novelties, establishing networks and commonalities is also handled by another researcher, sociologist Bruno Latour. Just like Margulis, he refers to commonalities, establishing networks, and he criticizes the scientific paradigm that ignores these. At the backbone of it, there is the machine universe design. So criticisms are uttered against this machine universe theory. So actually, Latour makes a distinction here. It is the process nature rather than machine universe. We shall focus on process nature, or nature as process in English. So we shall focus on nature as process, says Bruno Latour. The existing nature design has prevented others to inhabit Earth, and a modernization project, I will say again, for 200 years, a modernization project is at stake that is ignoring and actually leading to a misleading design of nature. It's actually the Galilean big discovery. It's such a scientific revolution that it is actually ignoring the developments in the planet and turning one's head to what is going on in different planets, different solar systems, seeking other planets in other systems, colonies to be established in the space. So the focus is now on this. But actually, the Earth that we are living in and its importance is less and less in the last 200 centuries. This is what Latour is criticizing. So yes, Galilean revolution was a big discovery, but then the impact together with the coming generations was exactly this, which is ignoring the importance of the Earth that we're living in and the systems in it. But as I said, this scientific horizon is making ordinary our planet within many other planets. On the other side, it is designing nature as something to watch from outside, forgetting about its dynamic and rendering unimportant each being a planet in itself. And the Darwinian revolution following it is important politically as well as scientifically, because the biological and chemical links and connections were at stake. And actually, the Darwinian revolution expands the Earth by making these connections. But Latour actually draws attention to nature being spoken about, but as an object in a laboratory, that there's a distance set to the nature. Or you can be close to the nature, you can create discourses close to the nature, but only emotions are being expressed. Seeing the Earth only as a nostalgic home, but also thinking of it as our main resource of our coming into being. Actually, our scientific point of departure should be Earth itself. It's not only home, it's an environment. It's what makes us ourselves in our relationships. And the Darwinian researches of Lovelock and Margulis are very important in this context for Latour. Latour says, together with Darwin, the path opened in front of us is an age of discoveries. These discoveries are like the conquests of the 20th century, with its targets of establishing colonies where if it actually succeeds on focusing on this Earth and its dynamics rather than some potential other planets, then it actually might lead to bigger discoveries. It might be very exciting, but actually also scary. First of all, the awareness of dependence on others might be scary at the beginning. It complicates, but then it makes us having to widen up the liberation attempts. All the scientific branches have to do with our planet. It departs from here and turns back to here. For a realistic view, we need all scientific branches, but we need to reposition these scientific areas. You do not need to be sent to Sirius to be a wise person, or you do not need to leave rationalism aside. Actually, we need nature as process instead of nature as a mechanical universe. And in that sense, the scientific field's repositioning and reviewing also refers to a new passion for knowing that focuses on nature as process, is what Bruno Latour says. And as a sociologist, he sees sociology as the science of commonalities. So it shall focus not only on humans, but also on non-humans. And he refers to such networks based on these commonalities. Commonalities between the differences, their intersections, their coming togethers need to be investigated in the sense that when you think of the chemical bonds to the legal connections to political constitutions from physical compounds, etc. So this definition sounds a bit weird. So let's say a new vaccination is marketed, a new business is conducted, a new policy is waged, a new planet is discovered, and new legislation is passed. In any case, we need to change our perception, our comprehension. Different commonalities, different collaborations change our perceptions. What is seen as belonging to us becomes blurry. Actually, it seems as if we are connected in a blurry way. The ozone layer, the hole in the layer is that of a narration, not only of something scientific. Actually, ecosphere discourse cannot be reduced to simple meanings. The networks are collective, just as they are narrational and discourse-based. So when we think about fault lines, pandemic, virus, earthquake, they all show that we are all connected. Interpreter note, a very poetic writing is being read. So what is being told here in natural culture continuity is this, if you ask me. So these networks are a matter of discourse and a matter of context, not only a matter of a physical reality. And COVID-19 pandemic actually showed us. So in terms of understanding it, COVID-19 was important. Actually, let me refer to the comment of the interpreter couldn't hear the name of the thinker. So we're in this together, but we're not one and the same is the name of the article written by this person whose name interpreter couldn't hear. So one of the main reasons for this virus was human activities. This is what is being underlined. And even though it was bats or some other animals or some things that actually spread this virus, even when we're talking about this, what led to such a pandemic was human activities and the deforestation due to human activities. Because the carnivores living in the nature comes to where humans live to find food. They migrated to where humans live, or they are being sold in animal markets, which led to a virus spreading and turning into a pandemic, if this is really the situation. So again, it all boils down to humans, and deforestation is the main reason. So the responsible here is humans that disseminate these animal markets, the cutting of the forests, of the trees in the forests, all these policies of pandemics. And together with the pandemic, we saw how not humans are equal and categorically equal, because each day there are those working, being forced to work in factories, having to use mass transit, or people not being able to benefit from supply chain are those who were harmed the most, which means that the neoliberal system is discriminating humans. And another dimension of the pandemic is having humans to face their vulnerabilities. And this also shows us that humans are not privileged among other beings.
Alanların yaşadığımız gezegenin bütün canlılar için bir ev, bir yuva olduğunu hatırlatırken diğer yandan
the pandemic reminded us that the planet in which we are living is in a cultural and political situation. So nature culture continuum is directly related to this. And this is the actually issue which we have to discuss. And we have some forced migration in all over the world. That's why the feeling of belonging is in a crisis. But it's important to make a record of this crisis and try to access more ethical approaches. I have a connection problem at the moment. I am trying to... I cannot hear the speaker at the moment. I think there's a problem. When the planet is thought as a homeland, it's not enough to combat the environmental problems and to select some areas to protect, because ecological crisis is not just a crisis related to nature and climate. Because it is more existential issue, it's a political issue. What's important according to Latour is first of all, it's important to discover a livable place and to decide with whom we will be living there. While drawing our route, we have to ask these questions. Latour, as a sociologist, is focusing on commonness. And while focusing on commonness, in many of his publications, there is a scientific background related to policy and ecology, science, nature sciences, and politics. Interpreter speaking, I don't know the gender of the author in question. That's why I am just rendering it as a he. When we are thinking together the nature sciences and ethics together, we are always in a dead end. Actually, he already states this, but he's trying to stay away from ethics and aesthetic dimensions. He's not going into details. I think Leopold is a complementary thinker. It's important to think about this planet as a homeland, and while focusing on the cohabitation in the philosophy ecology, we should also look at ethics and aesthetics aspects. André Leopold can make a lot of contributions with this regard. For example, Aldo Leopold has an important work which is titled An Almanac, so that we can look at the strategic dimension of the issue. How much time do I have? I think we are about to, you have to I'll try to wrap up. A Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. It's not actually, it is actually not only a soil ethics, but it's actually a planet Earth ethics. So land ethic looks at human beings as a part of biotic commune or biotic community. We are destroying the land because we see it as a property, but when we see land as a kind of community to which we are also belonging, we can use it in a more respectful way. There is no any other way to bear with this destruction, which is especially important related to the root oikos, which both exists in ecology and economy, and he is asking for an economy structured according to this root commonness, but existing economic system doesn't take this into account. This is a criticism by Leopold. And to think as a planet as a kind of ecological community, to respect to these ecological issues will be especially important in terms of its ecological and scientific aspects. She's reading a quotation very fastly. It's important to render it completely. Okay, he has some criticisms towards to science and especially profit-oriented science. If there will be questions, I can develop on it. About the aesthetic dimension, he's setting a measure for evaluating the human actions. When an action protects the integrity of the biotic community, it's a right action. Otherwise, it's a wrong action, which also compels us to give up seeing the economic use, seeing the land use just as an economic problem, but also looking at the ecological points. Industry gives us more comfort than pigeons, but are they adding anything to the magnificence of spring? we have to begin with the beautiful, understanding the nature.
Henüz hiçbir dilin tanımlayamadığı değerlere ulaşır. İşte turnaların değeri bence kelimelerle ifade edilemeyen bu evrede yatar.
So the flamingos are especially important with this regard.
Yeşilden sarıya, kırmızıya, kahverengiye dönmesinin bizde yarattığı duygular derken endüstrinin nimetleri, onun sunduğu konfor ile
While looking at the comfort of the industry, we have to also consider the beauty in the nature and how we can select or make a choice between them, or how can we force people to make a choice between them. This is the aesthetic issue innate to the point. This is also directly related to human psychology, which makes humans human. Speaking of far away, I'd like to, and if I don't have any time more, this ecology nature continuum we have to especially focus on the Darwinist biology. Leopold is an important name in terms of ethics and aesthetics, and while Leopold is criticizing this economic model, he is also looking from the Darwinist perspective. Actually, when Darwin gave the beacon related to the origin of species, we should have understood that we are not conqueror of the nature, but we couldn't do this. We cannot be aware that we are approaching our own end. As human beings, we couldn't learn this. Speaking of Gaia-politics, it's very important to understand this, because there is an evolutional aspect, but also Gaia has a mythological and political and cultural aspect into it. One of the thinkers which is emphasizing the importance of storytelling is Donna Haraway, a biologist, influenced a lot by Magnus, but she's especially focusing on the storytelling. She's one of the thinkers which is suggesting Capitalocene instead of Anthropocene, but she has another concept, Thulucene. It's based on a species of spider, Cuneat Tulu. Thulucene means changing the earth, like the earth has a strength with living beings such as spiders and octopuses, having, for example, 8 arms. And while attracting attention to Capitalocene, Haraway is supporting this expression. Also, we need a way out, which is Thulucene. We have to establish our stories together with these forces. We have to tell more stories related to non-human beings, how we are living together with the other beings, who are our allies. Maybe we think them as enemies, but actually they are our allies. We need their stories in order to stand in this ruin. And just as Marx quotes Horatius, "Dete fabula narratur," it's your story which is being told. So we have to continue to follow the evolutional line of this. While looking at this even more, we should understand that this is also a history of human beings, and we have to develop an ethics from here. And Gaia-politics is a way of politics which is inviting us to think on all of this. That's why I started from here. I think we need such a philosophy of nature. This will be end of my presentation. If it was too long, sorry for this. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. I have a fluctuating internet connection. Sorry if there are some problems related to my voice. because I lost connection a few times. We have around 15 minutes for question and answer and discussion. There are 6 questions. I want to ask a question too, then it will be 7. I'd like to thank to both speakers, but please answer it shortly. Galipcan Altınkaya shared the questions with me, then I will be reading through them.
So, Professor Schlottmann,
the first question is to Professor Schlottmann from Karun, Çekem.
I'll read her question in English. Hello, thank you very much for this great talk. I'm interested in hearing your insights on a certain debate. It seems challenging to strike a balance between advocates of a global shift to vegan diets for all humans and criticism suggesting that such a shift might impose a certain cultural way of life on societies with diverse dietary practices or those reliant on animal agriculture. Do you think insisting on a global vegan food reform could be described as a form of cultural imposition? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. In short, I think the answer is yes. And I say this despite believing that kind of all things equal, it would be better to shift dramatically towards more plant-based food systems. I think, if we think about it in, layers, what we would start with is just to say, hey, we have this problem. It's environmental, it's social, it's political, it's about farmer agency and autonomy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What are the biggest contributors to it? And which of those contributors are maybe unnecessary? And so it's not necessarily particularly imposing upon smallholder subsistence farmers to say that we should dial back the massive subsidies that we give to industrial animal agriculture, for instance. And so I think you're asking a very substantive question that is pretty tricky to resolve in and of itself. And I'm giving a bit of a practical answer, which is like, hey, there's some really big problems that we can resolve that don't necessarily impose cultural views on those who really don't deserve to have cultural views imposed upon them. And then, hey, if we get to that point, and we still have this sticky philosophical problem, then we can reconvene and resolve that problem. So I feel like there's a practical first step that gets us very far down the road of mitigating environmental harm before we have to get into some of the thornier questions about cultural autonomy and how that interfaces with environmental impact.
Okay, thank you very much. İkinci soru Ezgi Eyiler'den geliyor. Ezgi Ece Çelik.
The second question comes from Ezgi Eyiler to Ezgi Ece Çelik. In your presentation, you talked about the transition from the Anthropocene to the Novacene era. In fact, it's said that the Anthropocene starts with industrialization. What is the main cause of the transition to a Novacene era? Is it caused by an entropy in Novacene? Yes, please. Floor is yours.
O sunumun odağında yer alan bir mesele değil ama bahsettiğim gibi
Actually, it's not in the center of my presentation, but actually it's a suggestion by an author. We can speak about the Novacene, which is related to hyper-intelligence, machines, robots, non-human products conquering the planet Earth.
Evreni anlama çabasında olanın insan olmadığını gördüğümüz bir çağa adım atacağız diye bir iddia.
A new era where not only humans, not the humans, but the other beings will try to understand the universe. It can be an age following Anthropocene, but it's not a claim which is in the center of my presentation. Thank you very much. The next question, based on I have received them, Tuğba Özcan asks to Christopher Schlottmann.
Wouldn't the taste generated by natural agriculture still be more natural? That's all.
Our connection cut off a little bit. Can you repeat the question?
Okay. Yeah, sorry. This is a fact of life in Cambridge. The Wi-Fi connection fluctuates all the time, and sorry about that. So I'll read the question again. It's a 1 cent question. It says, wouldn't the taste generated by natural agriculture still be more natural?
Would the what generated by natural agriculture?
Wouldn't the waste generated by natural agriculture still be more natural? The waste.
The waste.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think part of my point is that doesn't really, it might imply something, but it doesn't actually get us anywhere when it comes to either empirical or prescriptive areas. And so the nitrous oxide from animal waste and the methane from animal respiration, ruminant respiration, the climate doesn't care if it's natural or not. It has a forcing, function in the atmosphere that traps greenhouse gases, and that contributes to climate change. And so the fact that it's natural doesn't change anything along those lines. And this is, at the end of the day, an extension of Mill's argument. Even if we have a good definition of natural, which he doesn't think we can, get, that doesn't automatically mean anything when it comes to an environmental ethic, a human ethic, or an animal ethic. So yes, maybe that waste is natural, but that doesn't mean it has a bigger or smaller impact on the environment.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll continue with the next question. Bir sonraki soru Erin Yalın'dan Ezgi Ece Çelik'e gelmiş. Canlı ve cansız varlıkların...
Question from Erin Yalın for Ege Ece Çelik. If we consider nature in the totality of living and loving beings, all natural objects have an equal responsibility to sustain their existence. Can we define responsibilities to nature?
Şeyiniz kapalı. Sesiniz kapalı, duyulmuyor.
Hocam kesik.
Your mic is off. I couldn't hear.
Tabii.
Can I take it again? She's repeating the question. Sorry for interruption.
Cansız varlıkların bütününde doğayı oluşturuyorsak tüm doğa objeleri varlığını sürdürmek için eşit sorumlulukta. Doğaya sorumlulukları tanımlayabilir
All
miyiz?
natural objects have an equal responsibility to sustain their existence. Can we define these responsibilities?
Tüm aktörler
All
dersek ya da tüm
actors, if we say
failler
all
eşit sorumluluk demek
perpetrators,
doğru
they have
olmayacaktır.
equal responsibility? Not really. That wouldn't be right to say. So we shall talk about responsibilities of humans, because being a perpetrator, being an agent is something else. And actually, they do not discern like living or non-living, inanimate. For biologists, it is not an easy distinction. This is what biologists say. They're talking about humans and non-humans. And actually, it is the agency of these humans and non-humans that form this earth. And actually, when we refer to the harm inflicted by humans, this is what we need to focus on politically. The question here is, when we place non-humans as agents, rather than this question, of course the agent, the perpetrator is human of politics, but we need to redefine what is human. This is the focus. Humans is not a super being isolated from other beings, but was formed, was generated together with other beings, that it is changing, it's transforming together with other beings. What makes human? Human is the other beings as well. So taking this into consideration, when we come up with a definition of humans, we need to ask the question of what the responsibility of humans are as political agents. It's not only about living and inanimate, but taking humans as located above other beings in a privileged status. Let's say Haraway says other comrades, or biologists say other coexistence, how we construct the Earth altogether. If we consider these, then we will need to reposition ourselves as political agents. And just like anthropocentrism argument, if humans are not at the center, then what are we going to put at the center? This is asked in politics and ethics. But rather than this, focusing on humans as not being an isolated being from other beings is what is at stake. Thank you very much. Next question is from Cem Kamozu to Schlottmann.
Next question, which is addressed to you. I find the need for simple stories very compelling. We certainly cannot run complex calculations each time we attempt to eat something, but simple stories by their very nature miss the complexity of ethical and political issues with our interaction with nature. So, is there hope to provide more, some morally good, simple stories that would provide guidelines if they are somehow in question?
That is the messiness of reality. And so, yes, I do think it's incredibly important to recognize that any everyday, by definition, somewhat general guiding principle is going to be overly simple. And I think kind of the task of the integrative practitioner and philosophers and everyone else is to make it as good as we can, while also admitting that at the end of the day, it's not going to be perfect. And so historically, you can think of all the examples. There's biblical examples, which are kind of rigid rules, and we have more contemporary Kantian kind of deontological examples that are also rigid rules. And in some cases, we know they're not as rigid, as they won't be as perfect as they need to be given their rigidity, for instance. And so this is where I find relational ways of thinking about ethics exceptionally compelling, because you might have some general guiding principles about a constructive relationship with animals and the environment and other humans, about kindness and respect and empathy, without necessarily proscribing every minutia of the exact relationship. And so the idea there is they kind of leave space for context and individual relationships and all of the complexity that comes there, but kind of narrowing it down enough that you have some sense of guidance. And so that's kind of, it's a second order answer to a very, very good substantive question. The idea is to kind of give us some guidance without reducing the complexity of relationships down to a simple set of rules or calculations. But acknowledging that it's imperfect is very important to recognize as well. I agree with that.
Okay, thank you very much. Sonraki soruya geçiyorum.
Switching to the next question, Şükrü Argan asks, again to Chris Schlottmann, written in Turkish. Let me read the Turkish, and I can translate to English. Dear Schlottmann, if I haven't misunderstood, nature's broad definition, including culture, and narrow definition, excluding culture, are both problematic, because the whole issue is nature, culture distinction. So by focusing on this complexity, the domestication of nature is natural. Let's say construct such a sentence. Instead of domestication, can we put culture, and instead of natural, we can put indispensable. So this indispensable domestication, is it actually to be left to the universal rationality?
So thank you. There's a little bit of a choppy connection, but I think I did understand the question, which is great. And so yes, the kind of working definitions, have the weaknesses that that Mill established, 150 years ago. Yeah, terminology like domestication and culture, I agree. These would all need to be, kind of spelled out with kind of strong working definitions. And I think I would just see domestication as a subset of this kind of larger area of different human natural interactions. So domestication might be slightly more aggressive than just kind of a cultural overlay. And you would also have domination kind of in this family of relationships to nature. And of course, many people understand what would be worrisome about something like that. And so insofar as, yes, we're into this kind of like deeply enmeshed relationship between nature and culture, who gets to decide what the kind of most constructive relationship might be, is, of course, even a bigger question than this already difficult question that we are facing. And it actually kind of comes back to Karun's question in a way, because what we don't want to do is kind of have some totalizing top-down conception of the only way to do things that, steps on the agency and individuality of individuals who are part of, this global citizenry that we're all part of. And so it's basically a political question in a sense, even though it has these kind of philosophical roots to it as well. And what I would kind of gesture at is kind of this domain of food sovereignty, right? Where in addition to environmental, animal, human considerations, one subset of the human considerations is a degree of agency that individuals have in determining their own path towards living a flourishing life. And then kind of you have this at scale, and then you can determine what a more sovereign food system might look like. And so that's the scholars in that domain, I think, would have the kind of more satisfying and I think morally rich response to that question.
Okay, thank you very much. Şimdi aslında resmi olarak zamanımızın sonuna geldik.
Officially, we are at the end of the session. But we will continue for 10 more minutes because there are new questions arriving. We have finished with the first cluster of questions. I actually had a question, therefore I will add this question in here, and then let's continue. A question to Schlottmann.
I'll ask it in English. So I understand why you're suspicious of arguments from naturalness, but I wonder if you give too much space to the other side. So Michael Pollan, for example, says, well, unless our aim is to rehabilitate the human soul, nature thing to do is to, do animal farming and eat them and not be vegetarian and so forth. It seems to me that one reasonable way to approach these arguments from naturalness is to deprioritize human beings as a kind that should rule over the whole nature. And if you do that, I think a natural step is to say, well, the extinction of the race is probably going to be the most useful thing for nature in general. So Michael Pollan might be, sorry, I don't know if you hear me. Michael Pollan might be undercutting his own position by his argument. And I wonder if you should allow so much to have him have that space.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And of course, there are so many caveats to any of these kinds of arguments. And one very important one is Michael Pollan is not a moral philosopher. I don't want to critique him as if he was, it's not fair. It's not charitable. It's really just kind of like reflective of this integrative analysis, which is kind of like, how do we think about this stuff on an everyday basis? And so it's kind of, I just wanted to give real world examples of people who use naturalness as a very kind of deterministic, guiding principle when it comes to this. Yeah, if you were to follow the argument to one of its logical conclusions, you could end up with all kinds of relatively, arguably undesirable outcomes, which is basically kind of eliminate all humans or something else along those lines. I don't know what Michael Pollan thinks, but I'd be a little surprised if that's what his view is at this point. I think he also has kind of a bit of a softer conception of how much naturalness guides things. But that view seems to simply just be very attached to a pre-modern view of how many people can live in the world and how they might live and what their habitation might look like. And I think that is almost automatically a commitment he's making by privileging these ideas so well. And so you can't have the kind of natural farm that he's talking about and have a lot of people. You really just need like a very extensive rural habitation structure, and therefore, like 1 billion people on Earth or something along those lines. And I think that's where it would be rich to have a conversation with him about these kinds of questions, because they are radically distinct from the way the world is right now, from the way the world is trending. And once you see that dissonance, right, that might kind of force, someone with these commitments to natural ideas to reconsider whether or not it all adds up at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you very much. Şimdi benim elimde henüz okumadığım 5 soru kaldı.
So there are 5 questions that I haven't read. 2 questions to Schlottmann, 3 questions to Ezgi. So I will read all of these questions all together so that in order not to extend the Q&A session. So the speakers can answer the way they like, so I leave the responsibility to you. Ezgi Ece Çelik. So Taygun Esen asked a question to you. He says, toward the end of the presentation, non-human beings' lives were referred to. Poor connection, interpreter note. It's impossible to hear the question. So so there might be a new approach needed. You will need to keep this in. It seems Ezgi also could not hear the question. So Ezgi also says that I couldn't understand the question at all. Maybe writing it in the chat box would be the best, because I totally couldn't understand the question. No worries. Let me read it again. And if you can hear it, then fine. If not, then I will try to convey by writing. Taygun Esen asks. So he says, toward the end of the presentation, you referred to the living experiences of non-human beings. And when we consider humans and non-humans, when we look at their communication model, in terms of coexistence, evaluating these stories might require a new approach in terms of hermeneutical tradition, maybe. Did you hear it now? Yes. And the next question, if you allow me, Umut Morkoç asks you. Connection problem. So if you can refer to what kind of relations is there between Leopold's stance and interpreter couldn't hear. If you could hear, then I refer to the third question from Bullet. So even if we speak regularly on politics, we do not talk about where our point of departure should be. Rossi Braidotis, Tim Totten or Ray Bracy say, once everything is over, then we shall start with politics, or shall we start about something to obstruct which is going to take place? One last question from Mehmet Sıray, if I'm not mistaken. When approaching Anthropocene, Haraway refers to the creatures that we can feed on. Therefore, gorgons calling gorgons and calling in earth gods, how would it contribute to the Anthropocene discussions, as Haraway also referred to the earth gods or under earth gods?
Şöyle bir dakika içinde dördü birden olduğundan
All four questions in 1 minute?
Tamam, yani soruyu soranlarla
Okay.
başka mecralarda tekrar karşılaşmak dileğiyle.
Hope to meet you at some other platform for those who have asked the questions about the hermeneutic tradition. Would it require a new approach, an ecological hermeneutics, or could it be thought this way? Well, I actually tried to delve into a detailed effort to try to understand this. Hermeneutical interpretation and the activity of this, that godly sayings being transmitted to the mortals. If we think of interpreting the Middle Age writings this way, that how to merge the stories of non-humans with those of humans. Actually, there's no such distance because humans are animals in the end. They are living beings in the end. And the commonalities here are so forgotten. We're so unfamiliar maybe with it that we need to remember nature culture continuity. We need to overcome the dichotomy of nature and culture might actually lead to might be a contribution of the new hermeneutics, but it might also be a Gadamerian approach. So maybe working in more detail or thinking in more detail is needed. I guess it was Bullet's question, where to start politics? Actually, this is a very big, important discussion. For instance, remember Latour. As an alternative to Communist Manifesto, he's talking about a compositionist manifesto. There's an article where he refers to this, and it was rather criticized as an alternative to Communist Manifesto. Talking about such a new manifesto is a big leap, a big step, it seemed to many people, I guess. But on the basis, Leopold says something similar. So, oikos. Actually, we're talking about a home where we're living with other beings that we shouldn't forget. And politics is directly related with this. Politics, economy, and law shall be on the basis of oikos. Oikos should be the basis of all these. And life sciences, ecology shall take as the basis oikos, or we shall start politics from oikos, not from cybernetic, digitalized, hyper intelligence, taking into robots, or taking into consideration a move towards future. There are such thinkers too, but what we need is taking oikos as the basis, taking living beings as the basis, or revolutionary biology as the basis would be one of the approaches. Well, this is maybe not Bullet asked, but, and also underground gods. Actually, Haraway is not referring to them. Actually, in Cyborg Manifesto, she is saying that between goddesses and cyborgs, if a preference is to be made, then even if they're connected through a spiral dance, like there are the stories of the gods and goddesses on the one hand, and the stories of the cyborgs on the other, I would prefer being a cyborg to being a goddess, she says. So actually, she's a thinker of this age, and she's excited by the technological developments. We shall not forget this. It's not only her focus on underground goddesses, but those living beings underground and on the ground that she's referring to, the spiders and the octopus or squids. So it's not only about goddesses, but those many-legged beings that Haraway is focusing in her latest research. Umut Morkoç's question is, well, I couldn't hear it because the connection was very weak. What kind of relationship is at stake? So I said that her 1949 book was especially renowned, and she has criticisms concerning industrial developments, and she is saying, or he is saying, that it is far away from understanding nature through life sciences, which is so industrialized and focused on profits. If this is the focal area, then we won't be able to understand nature. And the scientist here is not focusing on the right way. So this impartial positivist science is what she or he criticizes. I couldn't refer to it because there was no enough time. Interpreted note, it was probably Bruno Latour's approach. So, two questions to Schlottmann. At least I want to read them, so.
So, Christopher, the first question, there are two questions for you. The first one is from Özlem Yılmaz Silverman. The question goes like this. First, thanks very much for a wonderful talk. I was wondering, can you please say a bit on data processes and their importance on agriculture food systems? I think data processes, open parentheses, data production, data storage, data sharing, comparing, reusing, data interpretation, etc., close parentheses, seem to be crucial in today's world, especially in considering comparing local and global systems and the various effects of climate change on different locations in the world, and considering the complexity and also all the novelties in these systems and changing climate and all the ethical implications of possible misuses and misunderstandings of, I think, needed processes along with other experts. Was that audible? Okay, so let me then read the second question. That from Chin Çokuysal. The question says, you explained that modern agricultural and livestock practices have become unsustainable, but that proposals to return to pre-modern agricultural practices are also insufficient. Does this mean, for example, that instead of animals fed on natural feed, we should turn to technological solutions such as artificial meat? If you can answer both of these questions in the next minute, please go ahead, and then we'll take a break.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you. So brief responses, because they're both good points. The first on data processes is so exceptionally important because there are many accurate ways to represent the environmental impacts of agriculture, and they often lead to different implications. So if we look at crops, we get one assessment of where the impacts lie, but if we look at food types, we get a different kind of assessment. And there's a tremendous amount of obfuscation that happens either intentionally by industry actors or unintentionally by kind of well-intentioned people who don't understand the science. And so high degrees of data literacy are tremendously important, but then there's also this translational component of getting that quantitative complexity into stories that are understandable, because we're not all going to become kind of highly data literate when it comes to the complexity of climate science or agricultural science or anything like that. So it's a very important area to focus on. I did on the second question, also great question. I don't know, and I strongly suspect that no, this kind of like tech heavy way of thinking about food analogs is probably not a tremendously constructive direction to go in. It's very limited in terms of the individuals who might be interested in these kinds of food products. And at least initial evidence from the industry is that the uptake is not really there. This goes back to old environmental ethical questions about technical solutions and non-technical solutions. And this is, one of the menu options about how we think about our paths moving forward. And I would just say it's in the mix, but I would kind of caution with some skepticism that technical solutions are going to resolve many of these problems. I know we went over a little bit, but thank you so much for putting this together and for this great conversation, and to my co-panelists and everyone else. I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you much for participating and for keeping the answers, short. And so biz bu Schlottmann'da öykülerde doğallık, ardından da Ezgi Ece Çelik'ten
So we listened to Chris Schlottmann first, and then to Ezgi Ece Çelik. We listened to 2 speeches, and we have exceeded our time for 20 minutes. If there's no changes, then we convene at 6:30 Turkish time. If you like, interpreters might need to rest a little bit, so let's meet at 6:45. At least this might be a rest duration for interpreters. And we have another Zoom link to connect for the second session. So if it is okay for everybody, let's convene at 6:45. It was 6:30, but we can start a little bit later if it's okay for everybody. Then we have 25-minute break, and then Cem Kamazut will be the speaker with Karun Çekem's moderation. Let's meet at 6:45.